the fourth talk in this year's Open Mind Talk series. And we are very delighted to have a very veteran journalist working both in Hong Kong and now in the UK to talk to us about a very important subject related to journalism, whether in the case of protest or crisis, should journalists remain impartial or professional and all that, or rather adopting certain position and so on. Before we start, I think there's a number of house rules, very simple house rules. First of all, we will be doing the recording for today's talk, but it won't be filming the audience, so it would be only for the speaker in the front. But of course, you are always welcome to ask questions or comments during the Q&A sessions. The second thing is, please do not refrain from taking photography or recording on your own, because in order to be respectful to other participants in the talk, we first, other than the official kind of recording, don't do your own photography or recording. Well, that's about it. And we now about 20 minutes to 4. The talk will last up to 5:30. I hope the last half hour or more could be a Q&A sessions. And I want to briefly introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Stephen Mines. He's been a very experienced journalist, started working in Hong Kong from the 1980s, right? Yeah, up to a few years ago. And I don't know how many people know about that. In fact, Steve also operate catering in the catering sector. I remember at the CTU, we have a number of ex-colleagues from CTU's Garden Cafe, if I remember correctly. He's the boss. He's the boss. We have breakfast there every now and then. And without further ado, I would ask Steve to deliver the talk and talk about this very important subject, whether in a protest situation or in a crisis situation, what should a professional journalist do? Aboard to welcome.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I have two pieces of good news. The first one is I won't talk so long. The second one is the question that I asked, can and should journalists be neutral when covering protest movements? I'll give you the answer, it's no. So if you want to leave, that's it. No need for me to explain, but maybe I should explain. And what I really want to try and do is to look at this question in the context of Hong Kong, because that's where I spent most of my adult life as a journalist, and it was where the consequences of journalism became very, very problematic, something that none of us expected, except for towards the end when it became very obvious that was the case. So the reason why I don't think it's really possible for journalists to be so objective is because, believe it or not, journalists are human. And human beings have prejudices. And journalists, being part of humanity in some peculiar way, also have prejudices. You know, the Americans in particular, the American media are very serious about this. And if you look at some of their newspapers, like the Wall Street Journal, they have two distinctive staffs. One is for reporting the news and one is on the opinion page. And they don't allow people who do reporting to do opinion and the other way around. This is something which they think guarantees neutrality. This is a paper owned by Rupert Murdoch. You can draw your own conclusions about how neutral a paper owned by Rupert Murdoch may be. I have a very clear idea about that. Then you have the question of what do journalists do in a place like Hong Kong, when there is a very big confrontation underway, and journalists are part of the population of Hong Kong, and the general population of Hong Kong was quite clearly in favour of the protests, was quite clearly in favour of democracy. So it's hardly surprising that most of the journalists who were covering this situation were themselves reflecting the majority view of the population of Hong Kong, which was a pro-democratic point of view. The question then is, what happens when, for example, you're covering a protest, and this has happened to me before, but never like in Hong Kong, where you suddenly find that the police are actually targeting you, shouting at you that you're cockroaches, turning directly in your face, firing tear gas. I don't know how objective you can be in those circumstances, but I think the answer is not very. So what I would say is the only thing that a journalist can do is recognize that they have a prejudice, recognize that they have a point of view, but nonetheless to report as objectively as possible what is going on. Because if you can't do that, you don't have any credibility. I don't think that most people want to read a newspaper, listen to a broadcast, watch a television show, whatever, and just hear one point of view. Some people do actually, but I think that intelligent people like to at least be given the space to make up their own minds about what they're seeing and what they're reading. So I think that the pressure to be objective is a valid one, and it should be really worked at. For a lot of the time that I was in Hong Kong, I presented a current affairs program for RTHK, and also the radio program. RTHK in those days, this hardly is the case anymore, was a proper public broadcaster. In other words, it has responsibilities to the public rather than to either the government or to any private interests. And the thing that was impressed on us was every time we did any kind of reporting, and the program I was most involved in was mainly consisted of doing interviews with people who were in the news, people like Mr. Lee here. You know, we always made an enormous effort to have that point of view represented and another point of view. As the protests came around, and particularly after 2014, the umbrella protest, it was very, very hard indeed to persuade anybody from the pro-Beijing, pro-government side to even appear. And then they complained that we were biased because they didn't appear. It was very hard to sort that out. But anyway, you had certain people who would come along, and they were of varying quality. That's all I'll say about that. But the other thing that I really think we need to face the reality about is that media output isn't actually in the hands of journalists. It's in the hands of people who own and control the media. So that whatever our activity is in reporting or commenting on the news, ultimately it depends on the people who control the media. And they are very, very, very rarely objective. They very rarely have any desire to be so. If you look at Hong Kong in particular, the whole history of the Hong Kong media, and I actually want to talk about it just a bit later on, but the whole history of the Hong Kong media is established by people with very large business interests. In the very early days, the most active newspapers belonged either to the Kuomintang or the Communist Party, and obviously the Chinese Communist Party has a point of view, the Kuomintang has a point of view. So even if you're a well-intentioned reporter working for those outlets, you have to reflect what the people who own those outlets want you to reflect, and if you don't, they simply change what you write until it accords with their own views. There was another, I have to be honest about this, there was another problem, particularly during the protests of 2019 and 2020, was because of the uprise of citizen journalism, you had a lot of people who were wearing press identification, who quite frankly were not journalists. They were activists. Now, I and my colleagues knew perfectly well who these people were. We weren't going to run off to the police and say, that person there is not a proper, not that one, also not proper journalist. I mean, that is not something that I thought it was our job to do. But it did very much complicate the way journalists were regarded. Certainly it complicated the way the police treated us. And I think it was complicated in the way that the public were receiving information from the media. So I just mentioned this because it actually became a very big factor of coverage during that period. The thing about newspapers in particular, and I have more experience of newspapers than of any other type of media, is that newspapers almost invariably do not attract nice people to own them. When I was in London, I worked for The Observer. The Observer was taken over by somebody who probably is not well known to you, somebody called Tiny Rowland, who was the most atrocious person, and forced what had been a rather independently minded newspaper into all sorts of problems. And I also have to admit, because I'm in front of a Hong Kong audience, that when I was asked to start a newspaper in Hong Kong, it was under the Dong Feng Group. These are not nice people. The reality of that is that if you want to be involved in journalism and you only want to work with nice, reputable people, go and find yourself a job street cleaning, because that's a much more realistic activity. So these are the limitations which you have to work under. I have to say, things came to a very sticky end between myself and the Ma family, which went on for a very long time, much longer than I was a period as an editor there. But anyway, the other thing about Hong Kong, of course, which we can't just brush aside. I mean, at the moment, the new government line is Hong Kong was never a colony. I mean, that was news to a lot of people living there. It was a news to history books. But the fact that it was a colony was, I think, very important as far as the media was concerned, because although the colonial government made considerable efforts to control the media, I mean, right up to the 1970s, even the early 1980s, RTHK was really a government broadcasting station. It wasn't a public broadcaster. A lot of the news bulletins were written by what was then called the Government Information Service. The people who were running the station were appointed directly within the civil service, so it wasn't an independent body. What was so remarkable was how it evolved in the 1980s and 1990s into a genuine public service broadcaster, and produced some of the best news output in Hong Kong, some of the best cultural output in Hong Kong. The drama series that came out of RTHK, I think everybody knows, have a very big place in the development of Hong Kong culture and in people's hearts. So it was an odd period. The media that wasn't completely controlled by the government, the so-called independent media, was very heavily guided by the colonial government. They would call editors in, and if the editors weren't behaving properly in their point of view, they would call in the owners of these media and talk to them, and then talk to them until they got what they wanted. But the fact of the matter was that Hong Kong was always in a very strange situation, because you had a colony, and the colony was subject to a democratically elected government in London. And precisely because there was a democratically elected government, behind the colonial structure, it meant that the colonial government couldn't be as authoritarian as it sometimes wanted to be, and was quite heavily constrained. Questions would be asked in the British Parliament about things the colonial government did, and there was some degree of control. I don't want to overestimate that. And then there's this extraordinary, and I think it is extraordinary, because I've worked in, I think, all countries of Southeast Asia. There is this extraordinary appetite for news in Hong Kong. Newspaper readership in Hong Kong was higher per head than in any other country in Asia, certainly higher per head than in America, and not on a level with the highest levels of newspaper readership in Europe. So you had a population with a very high degree of literacy. This is a very important thing. I mean, the Hong Kong very rapidly developed from having quite a lot of people who couldn't read and write into universal literacy, more or less, which isn't universal in Asia by any means. Also, Hong Kong people had a high level of exposure to foreign influences and to the wider world. It's a fact that very many Hong Kongers have relatives overseas, travel a lot. I mean, it's a very unusual place in all of those aspects. So, when the current administration talks about foreign influence in Hong Kong, for once, they are right. It is a fact. Some people say it's why Hong Kong flourished so enormously. And then you have the other aspect of this, that Hong Kong, by default, not out of planning, became an enormous centre for the collection of information and study of what was going on across the border, precisely because across the border there was no freedom of press, there was no freedom of expression. So people gravitated to somewhere close by, but not inside the Chinese system. So you had a lot of China watching going on from Hong Kong, which had an impact on the media in general. It's a remarkable thing that the British colony was established in 1842, and so was the first newspaper. Most British colonies didn't have a newspaper in their first year of existence, and moreover, it was called the Friend of China. It was in fact a non-aligned newspaper. It was anti the opium trade, the very reason that the colony had been established in furtherance of the opium trade. The first newspaper was standing against that. Things soon changed. You then had papers like the Canton Register, which was controlled by the Judge Matheson group, who of course were in the opium trade, and funnily enough were quite in favour of it. But then you got this enormous proliferation of newspapers. There was really a large number starting. So you had this strange combination. Papers started by big companies and big tycoons. Papers started by the two rival political parties on the Chinese mainland, the Kuomintang and the Communist Party. And then you had papers that were more or less aligned with the colonial government itself. The big change, which looking around this room I know everybody's aware of, occurred in the 1980s. And I think it was part of the growing development of a distinctive Hong Kong identity, and an interest among people of Hong Kong in concepts of liberty, a self-confidence of a generation that had not been brought up under a dictatorship, had not had to flee the Chinese Communist Party, and wanted to assert a distinctive identity, which is what the Hong Kong identity became. And you had newspapers like Mingbao and Louis Cha, describe it, some people here may, as a radical newspaper. I don't think it was, but it was a paper where ideas were exchanged, where fine writing occurred, and where people went to be part of this growing development of a Hong Kong identity. In 1973, the Hong Kong Economic Journal was launched, which was also part of this process, and became even more so. And then if you fast forward to 1995, when you have the appearance of Next Magazine and Apple, well, before that there was Next Magazine, then Apple Daily under Jimmy Lai, you then get something, and people overlook this, quite dramatic. Not only did Apple Daily actually change how every single newspaper in Hong Kong looked. You remember before, the front page of Hong Kong newspapers didn't contain news. Apple Daily did. Hong Kong newspapers had really big pictures about this size. With Apple Daily, you had pictures that size. So that it was important not just because it was an openly pro-democracy newspaper, but to somebody like me, who was, how can I put it, who grew up in the culture of British newspapers, where there was a clear distinction between popular newspapers, which focused on sport and gossip and a little bit of political news. You had this paper, Apple Daily, that had all of that, lots of sport, lots of gossip, lots of scandal, but it had lots of foreign coverage. It had serious political coverage. So it set the tone for a development of a different kind of newspaper in Hong Kong. When I was involved in starting Eastern Express, which was in 1994, it was a strange. First of all, I've never started a newspaper before, so it was an unusual experience. And even though it came under the Dongfang group, because it was in English, most of the people there didn't read English, fortunately, so they weren't entirely sure what was going on in the newspaper. When they did, they didn't like it, but that's another question. But it was very interesting, the extent to which we could get people to contribute to that paper, to which, although we were the smallest of the three English language newspapers, we had this profound influence on the other two, who suddenly had to up their game and open their pages to a lot more different opinion, and indeed make them a lot more interesting. So, you know, this was this period, the late 1990s, it was very exciting for newspapers. I think it was very exciting for readers. The appetite for news in Hong Kong was finally being satisfied by a great variety of opinion. By 1997, if you look at the government official handbook, they said, this is largely nonsense, but they said there were 58 daily newspapers, 652 periodicals. That's the official figures. I would say there were 12 newspapers of any significance, and I don't quite know how many magazines there were. But anyway, it was a lot for a population which then was about 6 million. And then, you know, you'd have this long period where the popular press was dominated first of all by Sing Pao and then by Sing Dao, both of which papers more or less sunk into irrelevance with the rise of the newer media. The Oriental Daily came into prominence in the 1970s and more or less took away all of their readers. And then you had, alongside that, this funny little window of English language publishing. And it's quite interesting that now that there's only, yet again, 2 English language newspapers in Hong Kong, one of which is rather expensive at the price of free, in my opinion. The South China Morning Post actually sells itself. If you look at its website, it says it's Hong Kong's window to the world. Well, it's only the window to the world because it's in the English language, and it's assumed that the rest of the world doesn't speak Chinese, which isn't entirely true, but never mind. So you have that funny little corner of English language publishing, which had a lot of influence beyond the size of its readership. And then you had the broadcast media, more or less dominated by TVB, and TVB became, as everybody knows, the most notorious example of a mass media that was heavily political, heavily active in promoting the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. But none of this could stop the enormous wave of development of the internet and independent publishing. So, you know, you get into a situation, now we're talking about the late 1990s, more really to the next century, where lots of online publications came into being, lots of bloggers came into prominence, so that newspapers no longer became a thing that could only be started by, you know, tycoons or governments. The nasty feeling that's my phone misbehaving. Sorry, let me get them to turn that off. So you have this that situation where there was an ability just to sit down in your own room and start a publication, and with the hope that that publication would become some kind of influential thing. I'm sorry, I'm going to turn this off. It's so noisy. Just give me a minute. It's very keen to tell me how to get here. Right. Sorry. Just give me 1 minute and I'll actually get this done. Sorry about that. So, I want to come back to online media because it's become extremely important since the crackdown following 2020. But it's also important to remember that in Hong Kong, even as early as 1976, Hong Kong was registered under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And in 1984, the government signed it in its own right, and then we had the Bill of Rights in 1991. So you actually had, as part of Hong Kong law, incidentally not even repealed by the current regime, though they ignore it, but you had as part of Hong Kong law this stipulation, this requirement of freedom of expression and free media. I think that was important. But you can see how even if it is still on the statute books, which it is, and is ignored because the courts now will do what they're told to do, it becomes ineffective. But I think while it was effective, it did exercise the minds of the people with power over the extent to which you could have freedom of communication in Hong Kong. When I arrived in Hong Kong, which was in 1987, it was a complete revelation to me, because the paper that sent me was The Observer, and they said, oh, nobody's really interested in Hong Kong, but it's a good place. You can cover the Philippines, you can cover Indonesia, you can go to Thailand. It's got good communications. And I realized that Hong Kong was full of foreign correspondents. It was a very active international media centre. It was also the base for 4 regional publications, Far East Economic Review, Asia Week, etc. And it was a place where people understood, this is 1987, the fate of Hong Kong had already been decided in 1984. And I think we all lived in this false world. We thought, you know, an agreement's been signed for Hong Kong to be handed over to China, but somehow everything's going to be fine. And, you know, the evidence was everything was fine. Nobody was stopping us doing our work. It wasn't difficult to get a visa. It wasn't difficult to find people to talk to. You had, as far as I know, maybe I'm being naive, but you didn't have surveillance. I wasn't aware of having somebody tapping my phone or following me around, any of that, which is quite common. You know, I remember going to Singapore, when you were followed around, they followed you around like 2 steps behind you, so there was no mistake about that. Hong Kong had none of that. don't think there was a great design by the colonial authorities to make Hong Kong into a global media centre. But that's what happens when you're in a region where censorship is widespread, where infrastructure isn't so good, where access to good communications isn't so good. So Hong Kong emerged as this centre, and I think that had an enormous impact on the development of Hong Kong as a business centre. Because once you have good communications, free flow of information, a lot of other things happen as well. I'm going to just fast forward a bit. So that we then get to 1997. The handover comes, and we're all looking around saying, okay. And actually, not much happened. Things happened, and slowly things happened, but not much happened. And Hong Kong was getting these really good ratings in the World Press Freedom Report that's produced by the Reporters Without Borders, until 2020, when Hong Kong had the biggest decline in that survey among any jurisdiction in the world. And then we understood how dangerous it was to be a journalist in Hong Kong, how it was no longer the object of the authorities to have an objective media, to have freedom of communications. The people who flourished in the new media scene were the people who flourished precisely because they were not objective and they would follow the party line. So what's interesting though is because Hong Kong didn't have a fully developed censorship mechanism, and remember, and I always point this out to people, remember even during the 1960s Cultural Revolution rioting in Hong Kong, when people actually, which really was rioting, it wasn't like 1989 when people were being killed. We now see from the government papers that have been released, and you can look through them, that there was active discussion within the colonial government about shutting down the communist newspapers, Wenwei, etc. And they had that discussion. They decided that it would be an extremely bad thing to do. So they, of course, put them under surveillance, but they continued to publish throughout that whole period. In fact, they haven't stopped publishing since they were founded in Hong Kong. In 2020, you have a very different situation. Mass public defiance against the government, a leadership in Beijing that was getting frustrated with the local government in Hong Kong, was hitting out at this one, arresting that one, closing these things down, etc., etc. But they also managed to attach themselves to this culture that had appeared in Hong Kong, which wasn't of direct suppression, but was of enormous self-censorship. Everybody who worked in the Hong Kong media was forever looking over their shoulder, so sometimes they didn't need to be told, don't write about that, don't mention this, etc., etc. It became part of the media culture in Hong Kong, and I think now there's more direct control, but in the period immediately after the crackdown in 2020, it was still relying on self-censorship. I mean, to bring things up to date, we have 28 journalists have been arrested, charged with very serious offences. We have the closure of all pro-democracy publications. I think in all 22 have shut down. Radio Television Hong Kong has just become a government broadcasting station. And there's a lot of intimidation of individual journalists by officials, either from the liaison office or from the Hong Kong government itself. When we, I say we, I'm involved in this organisation called Hong Kong Media Overseas. We did a survey in March 2023 of what happened to Hong Kong journalists, and we found it very hard to give a real estimate of how many people had left Hong Kong and had settled overseas. But it was quite clearly in the hundreds, which is a very high number for a place which has a population of just over 7 million. We know that at least 900 people have lost their jobs in the Hong Kong, various parts of the Hong Kong media since the crackdown. And we know that if you want to get information about Hong Kong nowadays, you have to get it from Hong Kongers living outside of Hong Kong, broadcasting back into Hong Kong. Well, this is, anybody who knows anything about authoritarian societies knows this is quite typical. During the Soviet period, there were these so-called samizdat, so they didn't have the technological capabilities that we now have. But, among intellectuals in the old Soviet Union, they were thirsty for these little sheets of paper, these samizdat sheets of paper, telling them what Joseph Stalin was doing, what Khrushchev was doing, what all these awful people were doing. Now we have the means for mass circulation, audio, written, you name it, it's possible. My own view is controls on the internet in Hong Kong are inevitable. But at the moment, the internet's still open and you can get this information that people do. I mean, I work with Green Bean, Lookout, and we know for a fact that nearly all the people who watch it, and that's hundreds of thousands of people, are from Hong Kong itself. So again, this is a case of Hong Kongers outside of Hong Kong transmitting information back into Hong Kong. It's not great. I feel very frustrated about this because if you're not there, you can't smell what's going on, you can't feel what's going on. But it's better than nothing. It means that there is a channel of communication which is still open. Is that channel of communication free and objective? I would say, to be perfectly honest, the bulk of these, particularly the bloggers and the people who do broadcasts, are pro-democracy, so they're not unbiased. But you know where you are. They don't claim to be anything else. They don't say, oh, I'm an independent, I have no prejudices. So I think, and this is a general thing that I think, is that if you're honest about where your prejudices are, and you leave people to draw their own conclusions, once you've been honest, they will draw their own conclusions, and if they don't like the opinions they're in, if you live in Britain, you're free to go somewhere else. If you live in Hong Kong, not so easy. So we're in a situation now where the regime has no hesitation in jailing journalists, no reluctance closing down media outlets, very freely pumping out propaganda. I suggest a visit to the National Security Museum is a must. If you by some chance are still able to travel to Hong Kong. But what they can't do is kill the thirst for real information. They think they can, but they can't. This is the fatal flaw of all authoritarian governments. They think that as long as they keep pumping out the propaganda, people will believe it. And just to give a reflection of this, I remember after the Tiananmen massacre, I had this bright idea as a journalist. I went to Guangzhou, because I wanted to know what, we kind of knew what awful things had happened in Beijing, but we didn't know what was happening. Well, the rest of the world didn't know what was happening, so I interviewed various people, and I ended up interviewing this woman who had been she wasn't exactly, she was like a supervisor in a factory in Guangzhou. And I said to her, so what happened after June 4th? She said, oh, it was terrible. So what do you mean? She said, well, the party secretary gave us long sessions. We had to sit there for 2 hours listening to what the government line was. I said, so what was he saying? She said, oh, no idea, of course I didn't listen. And I think people become immune you know, because the official propaganda is so poor that some of it gets through, but by and large, people just, they're like they've had an injection. It doesn't touch them. So I understand the power of the Chinese Communist Party. I understand its ability to jail people in the media. I understand its desire to spend a lot of money on propaganda, but I'm quite confident that it's a failed effort. We'll see. I think what you can only hope for if you want to still be an independent journalist is to be part of the competition for ideas. And I think this is the crucial thing. I'm not so worried about whether journalists are objective or not, but whether people have access to a variety of opinions. They can pick. I don't think people are stupid. If they don't like it, they'll move on. So that's my basic, overwhelming belief. Allow a free competition of ideas, and if they're prejudiced ideas, so on.
Thank you. Very illuminating talk. Now the floor is open. We can have a sufficient time for discussion and comments. I think anyone would like to kick off the discussion? Just raise your hand and I can pass the mic to you. Anyone? Yeah.
A couple of quick ones. First, what do you think of Apple Action News? Secondly, I'll talk someone. Secondly, more serious one. Censorship and self-censorship before the latest crackdown after, let's say, the umbrella movement, as you pointed out, was not serious at all under the colonial administration, and you did mention that because the British government itself was democratic. But as a journalist, or as journalists working inside Hong Kong day in, day out, what was your sense of why censorship, looking back, why censorship wasn't as serious under such a unique atmosphere when, of course, 1997 and so forth is going on. Could you illuminate us a little bit from the inside, working as a journalist?
I think I better stick to that question rather than the other one, because I have to be honest, I don't read Chinese, so I know what's going on, but I can't myself read it. So, but okay. on that question of censorship, I think the truth of the matter was, and I can't speak of the period before I arrived in Hong Kong, but I was fortunate to arrive when things had actually already changed. So I started doing programs for RTHK, I think, in 1988, when it was already, this ethos of public broadcasting was very strong. And I remember that I was called in by, they had I can't remember what the post was, but they had a post in RTHK of somebody who was in government coordinator, or it was some ridiculous title. He was very upset with something I had done, so he called me in to have lunch with him. We had a long lunch, and he couldn't quite bring himself to say, don't do this and that. So we had a long, rambling conversation, and I pretended I couldn't understand what he was talking about. And he kept going, yes, but I said, no, I'm sorry, this is really, come on. And that was the kind of atmosphere. They were amateurs. They were sheer amateurs, these people. So what they normally did was not talk to individual journalists, but always talk to the bosses. So when I was at RTHK, my poor producer had enormous problems. I mean, down to when we got towards the end, they'd call her in because they said that I was wearing an inappropriate tie. dark, it suggested morning. But that's how they tend to operate. But I think in the late, what I call the late colonial period, I actually think there was a combination of two things. One was, I think they did genuinely understand that the world had changed, and that it would look very bad if you had an administration that was censoring the media. So I think that was the positive thing. And the secondary thing was, I think that they were very amateurish about how they conducted. You look at those propaganda campaigns from those days, it usually involved, let's hold hands together for better life, or, you know, they're kind of embarrassing if you look at them now. And they were run by people who had no real idea what they were doing. And one of the reasons they were so bad was that the government had a habit of employing the worst newspaper editors and the worst people who were senior in the media. After they finished doing their job outside government, they came in and they were a bunch of idiots, basically. Very few of them were, I mean, the reason why they were working for the government was they couldn't really get decent jobs in the professional media. So I think there was that amateurism, there was an awareness that this didn't look right. And then I think, you know, there was some sort of excitement around, you know. Hong Kong was, I'm sure, I don't know whether it's just me, but I thought there was a very kind of exciting atmosphere where the possibilities of what was happening in the media and the cultural era were just extraordinary. I mean, you think this is the period in which Hong Kong films, Cantonese films, were making enormous global impact. Canto Pop was making enormous impact, and the media was making enormous impact. So, you know, they suddenly realized they were sitting, they hadn't designed any of this to happen, but they were administrating this tiny little place which was having world-size influence. So I think there was a kind of feeling, we better not touch that.
And I suppose that they really like it when they know when you know that the Hong Kong, you know, what do you call it? The press freedom index was very high back then.
Yeah.
People would be.
And they would mention it all the time. Yes.
So yeah, thank you.
If I may add one or two little things. I worked for Radio Television Hong Kong in the early 1980s. The first thing when I report duty to the then controller of the Chinese service, Mr. Zhu Puheng, the first thing he told me was, well, we were practicing public service broadcasting. Therefore, the important thing is not follow the government, but follow the professional practices. And soon after that, there was a campaign to support one democratic activist who's being imprisoned by the mainland authority for 15 years, Lau Santing. 2 years senior than me when we were at Hong Kong U. I was a civil servant at the time, working for the Radio Television Hong Kong. I signed a petition, which in fact was in breach of the Civil Service Code. And the only thing I got was, Mr. Ju came to see me, did you sign it? I said, yes. All right, then I know that. And that's it. And that's the atmosphere at that time. So I mean, the kind of journalism, even working for a government department, distinguished itself from a strictly governmental department, quite obvious at that time. Anyway, any other questions?
Thank you. Hello. Because we had some local participants for today's maybe that you introduced about a very brief particulars about Wikipedia in Hong Kong, because over 95% population Hong Kong Chinese. So actually, we do have Cantonese speaking media and also English speaking media as well. I still remember so many years ago, there is a myth saying that compared with the reporting of the same news of Cantonese media and English-speaking media. English-speaking media is much more open tolerance than Cantonese media. For example, maybe for English-speaking media, they will interview like Martini as a channel, that kinds of politician that maybe the PR's authority doesn't like. But in Cantonese-speaking media, maybe those people cannot be appears over the mainstream media. Do you think this is true? That kinds of cultural practice, and if this is the case, where do you understand about the media situations in Hong Kong is based on the English-speaking media, or actually in Cantonese-speaking media, it can be another different story? Thank you.
Yeah, I actually think this is a pretty complicated issue because if you think about the bulk of the English language media, the point about that was that it was the media that was read by government officials who couldn't understand, who couldn't read Chinese. So on the one hand, they were very cautious, particularly the South China Morning Post as the leading paper, and they had a very concern. I think the one thing I can say is that after Eastern Express was founded, and we opened the door to a lot more critical comment, they opened up as well. So it does tell you that competition does change things. But the whole problem with the Chinese language media, I don't think it's that it was in the Chinese language. It comes back to the question of ownership. If you think about it, the big titles of Chinese language media, the big broadcasting organizations, ATV, TVB, commercial radio, they're all controlled by very pro-establishment figures. So their aim in life is to make happy with the government. But that was also true of the English language media. I mean, South China Morning Post was very close to the colonial government. Sally Orr, who ran Tsingtao, and obviously the Hong Kong Standard, was very close to the government, so she got in trouble with them. So, you know, I think people make a lot of that distinction between the two. But I can say, I mean, I just looked at RTHK. We could get away with a lot more in the English language than our Chinese language colleagues. I mean, I don't know if that was the case when you were there. But I mean, the program I was involved in, the Pulse, we were the last of the, I don't know whether I should be proud or embarrassed about this, but we were the last of the current affairs programs to be shut down. The Chinese ones had all been shut down before they got around. I think it was because they by then thought English was pretty irrelevant, so it wasn't a priority. But I don't know. I mean, I know people always say this, that the English language media was more open. I'm not convinced by that, generally speaking.
Well, if my own experience in the early 1980s, I think to a certain extent it is correct. It was correct to say that the high-ranking people, the elite of those establishment people, they pay more attention to the English media. That's for sure. I remember every time when I was in Germany's car, she's very generous. Leaving the stations, if she can give me a lift, she would do so. She's listening to the English channels anyway at that time. So it is important for people like her to be responsible for the seniors. I think that's the case. But gradually, I think things change. But anyhow, yeah.
One area Steve mentioned that I'm very interested, and also I'd like to know your views in the future. You mentioned this, for example, LinkedIn, now because Hong Kong newspaper reported self-censorship, some kinds of what they call genuine journalism, so genuine reporting, do not appear in Hong Kong. So Green Bean, as an example, actually some Hong Kong people click with the website and learn the news on there. That's okay. And another story made me very inspiring or fascinating. I don't know whether you know it or not. There's a young female student called Hadley Jen. That young student of City U.
City U.
He was specialized in IT and also medicine. IT actually. She discovered that two parents, there's parents of a daughter that enter international and local competition of some kind of medicine software was actually a parents give money to a USA company, draft the software program, that kind of thing. But it is not from the journalists, understand? It is from the local student. What I want to discuss with you is that if the student can do this thing, and I say in UK when I want to see something about, for example, about court hearing, I will not listen or read newspaper. I just read Faxing. I don't know whether you know in Chinese, in English, Faxing. He has a very long reporting of the whole process that inspired me. That it is a way out. The people, maybe in Hong Kong and in UK or Canada, want to understand what is going on in the court proceeding. It's not reading 文匯大公or even 明報 is very concise and very short story. What I want to ask you to make some comments that if this is some kinds of thing, we find that in this moment of time, they actually are inspiring some people to click in this kind of website to look at this information. Will it be possible that in the future, that more and more of these individuals, or individual small groups, or individual small company can do this thing? It becomes an alternative to the local Hong Kong media because they are so boring and not telling all the truth. That it becomes some kind of wave development that, why don't I open the computer and then look at this news and not buy a newspaper and books and all kind of thing. What is your views on this?
I think that's already happening. I mean, it's very interesting. RTHK used to publish figures about its use of its website, about how many people watch its programs. They don't do that anymore.
Okay.
Greenpeace does, because it's transparent. So, if a high, even in English, we've done things in Greenpeace where we have like 500,000 viewers. So I think already the diaspora, what I call the diaspora media, is taking over from the established media in Hong Kong with tiny resources. Tiny resources. So I think this is this thing about this thirst for information. People want it, and the official media is so discredited. Now, I think we always have to remember there is a group of people in Hong Kong who genuinely support the government and genuinely oppose. I don't know what percentage of the population it is, but it's significant. I would say it's reflected in elections for members of the DAB, etc., etc. So there are people who genuinely want that stuff. So that I imagine they're happy. And what is so interesting about this, and it's a consistent factor in any authoritarian society, is even the people who are most supportive of the government are frustrated because they can't get real information. This whole business in China where every year they used to report gross domestic product figures. So where you had all the provinces who put in, comrade, 10% of Huizhou, 30% from Shanghai. So you look at the figures and it comes out to some extraordinary figure of economic growth. And there's real frustration in Beijing because they know for a fact that all these figures are rigged. So in that environment, it's not just what I call ordinary people who are frustrated by this lack of information. So I guarantee to you that this diaspora media is read very heavily by officials, by people in the regime, because they have no good information themselves. So, what about ordinary people in Hong Kong? I think a lot of people, and this is just anecdotal, I'm told a lot of people just don't pay any attention whatsoever to the news now. They just don't bother with it. So you have that. You have people who still have this thirst for news. You have officials who are frustrated because the official media is so useless and can't actually tell them the real thing. So it becomes a very complicated picture, but I think what has already happened is that the diaspora media is becoming more important than what I call the established media in Hong Kong. And you look at some of these YouTube programs, people like Stephen Sue have, I don't know how many people listen to his program, but it's hundreds of thousands. There's nobody inside Hong Kong who's generating that kind of following. It does tell you that this process has already started in a relatively short space of time.
So your view actually in diaspora community actually is one area we should put more effort and resources, because they will go to a picture. They actually, the diaspora community, media community will somehow, because the major influence factor in the views of the Hong Kong people that not still live in Hong Kong.
Yeah. This is why, this is on another subject, but I think we should mention it. This is why it's so disappointing that Radio Free Asia has ceased broadcasting in Cantonese. This is a tiny, tiny little amount of money the American government is paying for this. It's a big loss. But but it comes back to your point. So who can you rely on? You can't rely on the American government. You can't rely on the British government. You can't rely on the French government to do all this. It's got to be from the resources of the Hong Kong diaspora. And it so happens that there's lots of media professionals in that diaspora. So it's kind of a source of optimism.
Yes. But my understanding is Fatin Sin or even Greenpeace. Well, they are very good and also very important, but they need more resources in order to have a longer term sustainability. Because one thing that Fatin Sin and Green Media, they are different from the KOL YouTubers, because they need a lot of production or spend a lot of time to report the proceedings in very detailed terms, and it costs a lot of money. Unlike those opinion leaders, they just can have very basic infrastructure and then they can get it. So if you haven't subscribed to them, try to subscribe to them. Okay. Further questions and comments?
You say it costs a lot of money, but most people who do it aren't paid. So it costs a lot of effort. It's
not only effort, it's in terms of money also. Yeah. We placed an advertisement for Greenpeace for this talk series last year, remember? And I was told that if they want to produce some advertisement for us, it costs them hundreds of pounds. But if you are a KOL YouTube program, it costs nothing. Yeah, it costs nothing because they need production, So that's the kind of things that I think outsiders they may not know. And Fatin Sin involves a lot of manpower in order to report those proceedings. It's unlike we just hold the mic and then talk about our opinions. Yes.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. My question, I'd like to bring it back to our title, which is, should journalists be neutral when covering protest movements? So I was wondering if you could share some anecdotes of your encounters with protest movements on the ground, and also lessons that we can learn if we're involved in social movements, and also what recommendations you have for getting the press to give a fairer coverage of protest movements and social movements.
Well, I think you always have to start from the basic reality that however much the journalists who are actually covering these social movements may support or oppose or be brilliant at their jobs, ultimately what's produced in the media isn't up to them, it's up to the people who control the media. So, you know, having said that, it is interesting to me is that I spent a lot of time, particularly when I first arrived in Asia, covering protest movements in the Philippines. This was after the fall of the Marcos regime, and then in Indonesia after the fall of the Suharto regime. And of course, you get to know the local journalists, Indonesian and Filipino journalists. They were actually very supportive of the protest movement. But the official media, the mainstream media of both of those countries, was not. So a lot of them were working for that media, and they felt very impotent. But in the end, the movements were so big that the big media organizations themselves had to bow to public pressure. But I think the reality is, what I come back to, I think that journalists are prejudiced. I don't think you can be objective. If you live in society, you have a view. You know, it's like nobody says that a football journalist shouldn't support a football team. I have never met anybody who writes about football who doesn't have a football team that they support. So what do you say? Well, we're not going to have them covering football matches, bloody Arsenal supporters or whatever. So just recognise that they start from that position and then ask, can you still do a good job reporting on the football match? It is quite interesting. You know, people, particularly in Britain, say football's much more important than religion. So, you know, I think people just do have prejudices. Sometimes they pretend they don't, but they do. But even if they do, that doesn't stop you doing a good job. And it doesn't stop the existence of a media that reflects different opinions, except for in authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, further questions or comments?
No, just that you guys are talking about the local commerce may not even read local newspaper or read media in Hong Kong, but relying on overseas media in order to be informed. I worked in the government for more than 10 years, and even when I was in the government did not even cares about non-traditional media. For example, even Stan's news, its reports were not in our daily newspaper cutting. All we received were like Maple, SPCLP, etc., Apple Daily, etc. I'm not sure whether it is still the same now. But my point is, would it become a parallel universe that the governments know nothing about what the general Hong Kongers know or think on the one hand? On the other hand, even if overseas journalists or Hong Kong medias, as well as those independent individual medias, work very, very hard in informing us, but there will be no impact or very little impact on the government or affecting the public policies in order to bring some form of changes. Even the little bit of change will be good, however, it appears no, I refer to the example Linda mentioned about that a girls got so many important prizes from Hong Kong's competition. However, a CTU student found out that that software, that application was actually done by a foreign companies. It was all over the internet and every Hong Kongers know it, but the government did not do anything in order to rectify the thing.
There's a lot in that. But let's just start with what you say about your experience as a civil servant. That is a fact, isn't it? That they used to circulate every single day a media digest, and they never included the online media. I think this just reflects their stupidity, is they didn't realize that the online media was so important. So, yes, again, you have an example of the government being manned by so-called media specialists who just don't know what they're doing. Then you have the whole problem that they have of reality. And I think in Hong Kong, you had the absolute perfect example of this in 2019 during the district council elections. So all of the mainstream media were saying Democrats are going to be published, people are fed up with the rioting, they want to get rid of the troublemakers. Well, this was then faithfully reported by Carrie Lam and all the people up to Beijing. Don't worry about the 2019 elections, we've got it under control. You look at our newspapers, look at this headline, Democrats set to lose so many seats. So in the end, it is what we're talking about. There's a parallel reality. There's what everybody else knew. I mean, I think everybody and their dog who had any intelligence knew that the Democrats were going to do well in 2019 during the district council. Even I knew that. so, you know, but from their point of view, they tend to start believing their own propaganda. So that's a big problem, isn't it? Then you have the, how do they get around it? Well, in Beijing, of course, within the Chinese Communist Party, they have their own system of internal communication, which has real news in it. So I imagine, I have no idea, I mean the Hong Kong government is just so inadequate and so dumb. I don't know whether they're going to start, maybe they will have to do what they do, what the Chinese Communist Party does, and has their own internal monitoring mechanism. Yeah, you're shaking your head, I agree with you, I don't think they're going to do it either. But I'm just saying, it is interesting that the Communist Party itself does this. They don't, I don't think they've ever officially recognized it, but I mean, it's been so extensively reported, including by people who used to be quite senior within the Chinese government, that I think it is a fact that such a mechanism exists. So you've got that. You've got the fact that they're pretty useless at propaganda. You know, these parades, really, allowing children to get involved in gambling situations because it's part of Hong Kong's drive to increase visitors, telling taxi drivers that they've got to learn Arabic to encourage movies. I mean, you know, you just look around at all these bizarre examples of what they're seriously presenting as ways to stimulate interest in Hong Kong society. And you realise you're really dealing with them. They're great people. So I think on the media front, no respectable and I think I can say this without qualification now, no respectable person in the media will do any work for them. That day has gone, so they're left with the, I mean, I know from RTHK where so many people have left, I know the people who are left, my God, those were not the people you went to if you wanted to get a good program made. So, you know, this is the other problem with autocratic governments, is they don't really attract talent. It's sometimes cynically because they have a lot of money, they can pay people a lot of money to do things, but they don't have the commitment. I mean, one of the things which struck me, even though you worked full-time for RTHK, I was just going in and out as a contract, but I could see, as an outsider, there was this sort of real strength of commitment to the idea of public broadcasting within the organisation. That was nothing to do with money, nothing to do with the fact that people had a job. When it's just cynical, I'm going in every day because they're paying me, or if I'm sufficiently sycophantic towards the government, I'll get promoted. You look at the results, they're going to be very poor.
Thank you. Further questions? Yes?
Just before your arrival, we had a casual discussion on the situation of Gaza and how BBC is covering the war between the Palestinian and Israel. So now, you know, if we shift our discussion from Hong Kong to UK, BBC is supposed to be owned by the people. We pay the TV license. I don't know how you interpret that, and what's your comment on how BBC is, you know, putting back into the context is when they cover something like protests or as extremely as the war situation. How would you see BBC's performing as a public broadcaster?
I have to admit, I actually started as a journalist covering the Middle East. That was what I used to do. The one thing I know is that two things actually, is if you wrote favourably about any, you know, one side, you were accused of being in their pay. If you wrote unfavourably about one side, you were automatically accused of being some sort of foreign agent, of being planted in the organisation. I mean, this was very common. People would get in touch and say, well, I know you're a CIA agent, that's why you're writing this and that. You know, nobody ever asked me to become a CIA agent, so I don't know. But in that difficult situation, where the passion is so high, where the situation is so difficult, you know, we talk about the fact that dozens of Hong Kong journalists have been arrested. In Gaza, hundreds of journalists have been killed. So, I mean, there's no comparison. It's much more extreme. I actually think the BBC does an okay job. I don't think it does a wonderful job, but I think it does an okay job. If you, I don't know if you ever watch it, but if you watch Al Jazeera, which is the, yeah, it comes out of Qatar. Yeah. They actually have journalists on the ground. It's the only international station that has journalists on the ground in Gaza itself. I mean, there's no doubt this is a pro-Palestinian operation, but actually, if you want real information about what's going on inside Gaza, it's indispensable. The BBC can't even get in there. They're not allowed in. So, you know, given the limitations, given the fact that everybody is suspicious, given the fact that passions are so high about that conflict, I think they do okay. Probably better than most, actually.
Those journalists face this question day in and day out.
Yes.
The journalists, you know, covering the stories in Middle East face the question, your original, the topic of today, day in and day out.
Yes. And but it's just more, I mean, I'm glad you brought this up, because it is so extreme there, compared even, you know, I'm more emotionally attached to what's happening in Hong Kong, but you can't turn your eye away from the extraordinary difficulty of reporting in Israel-Palestine.
What is the relationship between the journalist and the editor, and or the big boss back in BBC UK?
I wonder. I don't know, because I'm not there anymore. But I do think the BBC still has this strong ethos of being a public broadcaster, and they do allow their journalists to more or less operate. You know, they say you report what you see, not what we tell you to see. That's the basic difference, isn't it? I mean, I did sometimes watch. I've given it up because it's just so ridiculous. Watch what do they call the Chinese propaganda? Central televisions now.
CCTV.
No, they have the English language.
Oh,
They
yeah,
have a
English
different
language,
name. What's it?
CGTN.
Yeah. I've given it up because it's just too ridiculous. I did sometimes watch it, and I was quite interested in their Middle East broadcasts because, of course, you have to assume, and it's safe to assume, that everything on there has been approved by some political figure before it gets onto music. But when you got to the Middle East, because they weren't, because I've stopped watching it, I don't know what they're doing at the moment, but at the early stages, China hadn't actually decided exactly what their position was. They were vaguely in favour of the Palestinians, but vaguely not. So their coverage of Gaza was almost comical. You know, because you never understood. They never connected any of the points. They just sort of randomly said, oh, this building got bombed. Half the time they didn't even say who bombed it. And I was thinking, gosh, this is really what happens when you have broadcast media controlled by people who only have a political agenda. So you can't accuse the BBC of that. But you know, a lot of people are dissatisfied with the BBC's coverage. Now, I'm not, but a lot of people are.
And you still, I remember you have a book published in 2021, and in that book you have a chapter saying that Hong Kong is not alone, the world is watching. Yes, I want to know, are you still optimistic on that? Because we know that in Hong Kong now, the mainstream media has largely become propaganda. This is the one point. And the second one is that today is September 28th. I read all newspapers from Hong Kong today, and not a single paper mentioned about September 28th, 11 years ago.
What? Except for Free Press.
Yeah, they're all press. And lastly, I have a friend, she's now working for the BBC as a freelance correspondent, and she told me that in recent months or over the last 2 years, when she proposed some stories about Hong Kong, the editorial reaction is that stories are becoming more and more similar, and they think that no audience or no reader is still interested in those stories. So I just want to know whether you're still optimistic that Hong Kong is not alone, the world is still watching.
Well, I think you have to be realistic about news coverage. There's so much going on in the world. There's Ukraine, there's Gaza, there's just bizarre things that go on in America, just unbelievable. So, you know, in that sense, Hong Kong goes down and down on the agenda. Hong Kong doesn't have a Nelson Mandela. You know, you need to keep a story alive. You need a person. I always think this, you need a person. Hong Kong has, I think if people have heard of anybody, probably it's Jimmy Lai, but you know, we all think Jimmy Lai is very well known. Frankly, he isn't. He's well known, obviously, to Hong Kongers, because people are interested. So I think Hong Kong has got a real problem in keeping, for the democracy movement, I mean, keeping it in the news. I do think there's a lot of goodwill towards Hong Kong. I mean, I'm always surprised when I just meet people who have no connection with Hong Kong, and I say, well, I'm not living in Hong Kong anymore because of the political situation. They go, oh yeah, it's terrible, it's become part of China, hasn't it? I mean, people, I think, generally do actually understand. I mean, it's not quite that simple, but that's kind of true, what they're saying. So I think there is an awareness of Hong Kong. I actually think it's quite a big awareness, considering Hong Kong is such a small place. So I'm not totally pessimistic, but I do think very much Hong Kong and the democracy movement in Hong Kong, there's nobody coming to the rescue. It's always got to come from within. You know, to carry on campaigning. You know, we've got the big trial coming up for the Hong Kong Alliance people next month. You know, that there's very little awareness of that. So the only way people become aware is you have to work at it. It won't just happen. And I think at the moment, Hong Kong will only become a story, and I hate to say this, but it's true, it will only become a story when something really bad happens. Because you can't really think of anything really good happening right now, can you? So you know, it's unfortunate, but so you know, but I still do think it's remarkable how much what level there is of interest in a place which frankly has 7.4 million people, population's declining, maybe 7.3 at the moment.
And I suspect there are still opportunities that the international media would pay attention to Hong Kong. I remember in 2019, The Economist, 3 times during that year, put Hong Kong as the cover story. I can't imagine any other time this magazine would put 3 times, not even in Ukraine, Gaza, up to now, so on and so forth. So it's really extraordinary, at least to me. Anyhow, yeah, we still have some time.
Just to add to that, I mean, when I first came to Hong Kong, as I said, I actually spent most of my time outside of Hong Kong. And I remember trying to get into the paper stories about Indonesia, and I kept saying to them, you do realise this is the biggest Muslim country in the world. It has an enormous population. And they went, yeah, but what do they do there? They're just there. They exist, and they're about to change a regime that's been there since the 1960s. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, we'll cover that when it happens. And they did, to be fair.
Thank you. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. The first is that you said that actually humans are humans. You know, and journalists in general, they do have their own stance. Is it true that they would just be gravitating to organizations that shares the same ideology or the same viewpoints, otherwise they can't survive?
You mean journalists? Or?
Yeah, like if a journalist working for a left-wing newspaper, probably he is also supporting those arguments. Otherwise, they cannot survive. Can I just be very grossly that, if you work for these organizations, then I can pretty sure that you subscribe to the same principles of that organizations? This is the first question. And the other, I really appreciate you're so honest that we need to address our own prejudice. But these days, the journalists during their training is being objective, is also being emphasized as they're being trained on.
Yeah. Well, let's start with the first one. I think that's largely true. I mean, let me look at it from the other point. Would a journalist have gone to work for Apple Daily if they were really pro the Chinese Communist Party? I think it's highly unlikely. Would you work for Wen Wei if you were a Democrat? So it's precisely because the Hong Kong media is quite polarized, well it was, it's not anymore, but among the established papers. So, you know, a lot of the reason why Abu Dhabi had such an enthusiastic staff is they recruit a lot of young people who are really inspired by the 2014 movement. That was when the paper was in its younger days. So yes, I think what you say is absolutely correct. But it is quite interesting. In Britain, the situation is not quite the same. So I used to have a lot of friends who worked for the Daily Telegraph, which was always considered a very conservative newspaper. It's now just a waste of space newspaper. It used to be a very good, I think, a very good newspaper. I don't share its politics. And I had a lot of friends who worked there which didn't share its politics, but they liked the professionalism of the paper, and they liked the fact that it took news seriously. So, you know, I think when you've got a more liberal environment, it is possible that people don't gravitate towards media for, if you like, political reasons. And your second point, sorry, was about
training.
Oh yeah. So I'm very skeptical about that. Well, maybe I reflect my own prejudice again. I've never actually been formally trained. I've never been to journalism school. I think that I know they talk a lot about objectivity and ethics and blah blah blah, but I think first of all I think it's very important to understand that journalism is not a profession, it's a trade. It's something you can, in my view, you can only learn from practice. So, you know, going to a lot of lectures about objectivity is very lovely, but I just don't think it's realistic. I mean, it's a noble ideal. I would like to be more objective than I would like to be more objective than I am, but it's an ideal. But I think when you're confronted with covering events, you are going to be swayed by those events. I cannot believe that anybody cannot be swayed. I just give you another example. Earlier in my career, I was also working, this was again for the Observer, I was covering the miners' strike, which was the biggest trade union activity in England in the 1980s. And I'm from the south of England, so most of the miners are in the north of England. To be honest with you, I'd never been to a mining town before this. I had no idea what was going on there. We started to go to these mining villages where most of the population was on strike, where because they were on strike, they didn't have any money, so it was a pretty difficult situation where there were quite violent confrontations with the police. Now, I kind of went along as a really outsider. I didn't know what was happening, but as soon as I was there, and I was there weeks, months, in the end, over a year on end, covering this, sure as hell developed strong prejudices about what was happening. And I think unless you're not human, how could you not do that? I know my colleagues. I mean, I work very closely with people on other publications. I think we were all affected by the same. Look, to be fair, a lot of them had a lot more knowledge than I did, and actually knew these places much better than I did. So maybe they started out with views, but just by observing, I think you cannot but not become involved. I think that's the thing.
Thank you. We still can meditate a bit more. Yeah.
No one is. Speaking about this matter of the trade that you just mentioned, and echoed earlier discussion about parallel world, and readers in Hong Kong will have to read outside on diasporic media in order to. Now, my concern here is what happens to the news organizations, journalistic machinery, let's put it, in Hong Kong, the mainstream ones especially. Assuming that the situation in Hong Kong, the current situation would last for a while, so what do you see happen to this machinery going the way it does now? Probably not. I don't know. Probably are going to attract good people into the organization. Are going to train good people who learn this trade as they proceed. And if that would not be the case, what is the prospect of Hong Kong? And in the back of my mind, I also pop up this new project of the Pulse. I mean, not the one that you work with, the new one. So I wonder whether you comment on its prospect.
Well, can I just deal with that one first, because I'm very enthusiastic about that. Not least because it's the first sign we've had in diaspora media of serious cooperation. I think that there's a lot of, I know from my own organisation, Hong Kong Media Overseas, I mean, our view is there's too many diaspora platforms, and if the resources were pooled, it's much more likely to produce a better product. So the Pulse is exactly this happening. I think it's 3 organisations have come together to do it.
So the Radio Free Asia.
Yeah. Well, no, and other people who, but I'm talking about 3 existing publications will no longer, you know, they'll be integrated into that. So I think that's hopefully the way things are going to go. Is there's been to be frank, very poor levels of cooperation between diaspora media platforms. So if this is the beginning of another trend, which makes that happen, I think that's really good news. So that's what happens. This is very interesting to me. What happens to these established mainstream media organizations in Hong Kong? They will be the living dead. You know, they will continue to exist, all of them. You know, RTHK will still say, oh, you know, we're a public broadcaster. Nobody will watch. The newspapers have practically nobody reading them anymore. They give them out free. You know, the communist newspapers have always been given out free. I don't know if anybody ever bought them. But I suppose the communist banks and what have you. Arthur Lee, yeah. He's a fantastic guy. So you know, but I don't think it's unfair to describe them as the living dead, because they will carry on living, and they will just go through the motions. I mean, I was very sad because I was quite involved in it. The Foreign Correspondence Club still exists in Hong Kong. Well, no, it's a fine restaurant. It's a fine well, it's in Central. Everything's expensive in Central. but what I'm saying is, they keep the form and they strip it of all content. So I think this is quite typical of what happens in all of these regimes. I mean, the difference in the mainland is that they didn't really have that many institutions, you know, these sort of, they certainly didn't have social media, but they didn't have that much to destroy, so they just brought in their own, you know, People's Daily, Central Television and what have you. These were just, well actually the Kuomintang also had their own organizations, and they just moved them off to Taiwan, where, you know, where they were also dying incidentally. So I think, it's unfortunate because some of the people who work for these organizations, I don't think they're all bad people by any stretch, but, you know, by and large, why would you, if you were a young person starting out your career, why would you want to work for example, for China Daily? What madness would, unless you were so desperate for a job, that maybe, well, that's not a good reason to do anything.
This question may be a little bit unanswered, but I want to ask, and also if anybody in the floor can share the reaction, I want to know something else. Because in the past governments, they usually have their own channel to collect public opinions. One way is through the newspaper, or the news they publish what kinds of opinion to collect through the newspaper, or university, the public university they will conduct public opinion poll. Now close, and Chinese show not so frequent. Sometimes they have some opinion poll, and also some. So I want to know, how can a policymaker, a minister in the Hong Kong government, how they formulate the policy without knowing what the people think? I don't know whether anybody here, I lost contact with the government official already many times, many years. So I wonder, when they start to deliberate or think about new policy, what they're thinking about, what the people need, or what the people support or not support. So anybody, or you, or anybody can give me some information how they can think about this thing now?
I'm pleased to say this is their problem. I mean, you know, if you destroy, if you destroy civil society, which is essentially what's happened in Hong Kong, if you close down the public opinion gatherers, if you make sure that the media only follows the party line, you have, I think there must be a genuine sense of frustration that they have no actual means of gathering real opinion. But maybe they are just so deluded, you know, they still carry out elections, and it doesn't mean anything. I mean, it's only their own people who get elected, and they go, oh yes, we still have elections in Hong Kong, still a democratic society. I mean, unless they're so deluded, but I think in their heart of hearts, they don't kind of, it must be, I'm so glad they have this problem. It must be really frustrating.
I don't think they care.
Well, maybe not, maybe that's the reality, yeah. But I think there must be some
They see
people.
themselves to execute some top-down directive.
Just 2 days ago, the Single Daily, the headline of Single Daily is that, according to a poll conducted by Single Daily, more than 60% of respondents are encouraged by policy advice.
There you go.
That's 2 days ago.
And the
Carry on by what?
Single Daily.
I said no, that's okay. Just let it go.
And the latest news from North Korea is 99.8% people
They are
support the
self-deceiving.
government.
It's a self-deceiving.
It's a
It's a self-deceiving approach to government.
My experience is that government officials think everybody else are dumb. Yeah, for example, when I just during that, previously I worked for lawmakers, and when I joined the government, they are not they are not even ashamed of saying that lawmakers do nothing. And so they are happy for a legislative council that no one asks important questions, because they can just do whatever they do. So when I entered the government, when I joined the government, I truly experienced that the civil society, no matter how noisy or how unprofessional the questions asked by, for example, local councillor, etc., it exerted a lot of pressure on the government when they decide, when they formulate their policies. So that they think a lot of things, for example, whether the law or policy will be judicially reviewed, whether councillors or lawmakers will complain or whatever, write letters to them, etc., etc. Answer to Mr. Lee's question, the government did not care, but even when I was in the government before I came here. And I believe that the situation is even worse.
But you know, it is interesting. I mean, actually, civil servants here don't think much of MPs either. So I don't think that's just a Hong Kong thing. But you know what is interesting is they now take that they say, you know, oh, the whole world is unfair to us, all these awful foreigners writing things about Hong Kong. But they've now started to do these long responses to newspaper articles produced. You know, they're in perfect Beijingese, you know, we resolutely denounce the irresponsible, you know, and they go on and on, you know, it is, you know, gross interference in the internal affairs, you know, on and on and on. But, you know, the fact that they feel compelled to respond does actually show you that it is getting to them maybe a bit, maybe not a lot.
Well, if I may supplement a little bit, I may be out of touch already because I have not involved in the government or media in Hong Kong for quite some time. But judging from my previous experience, either as an administrative officer in the Hong Kong government policy-making branches, and also in the central policy unit, where people like Professor Chen, we served together at one point, and our interaction with those mainland informers. Don't forget that they collect a huge lot of information with a lot of manpower to do that. Some formal, some informal, some overt, some covert, that kind of things. And in fact, when the central policy unit was still around, they conduct their own surveys, opinion polls, focus group discussions, and also the kind of a scenario, kind of assessing different scenarios. For example, what would happen during the Occupy movement before it happened, things like that. And judging from the mainland agents being sent to Hong Kong to collect information, on all those occasions, I can see many of them around, gathering information and all that. And even the social media, I remember about 15 years ago, they already tried to commission certain IT companies to kind of come up with a method to try to survey the opinion on the social media, things like that. And not to say, in a way, for the EXCO paper, before they deliberate making a policy decision, there's always a mandatory session talking about the PR implications, so on and so forth. I'm not saying that these are enough, but I just want to supplement that, in fact, it has a rather elaborate kind of network and mechanism. Whether they can utilize them or how best they utilize them is a different thing. Of course, all these things normally would not go to the civil service as a whole. It is rather targeted. So in a way, let's be realistic. The Communist Party in China is one of the best surveillance kinds of regimes. And there's some reason for that. We need to be careful about that. Okay, we can still entertain one or two last questions or comments. Anyone would like to raise the questions or give the comment before we still have 5 minutes or so. Anyone? Well, if not, I do have a question there. Oh, yeah, if you have, yeah.
The last one, that's very good.
It's a silly question. It's kind of a dilemma because nowadays a lot of these media are free. We just subscribe, but we don't have to pay. However, since we know that they are so polarized and actually everyone, no objectivity, we cannot expect a higher level of objectivity. Does it mean that we have to get ready to pay? I'm frustrated because I think if I need to, in the past, I can just buy 1 or 2 newspapers and then I think I'm pretty happy that I have a pretty good representation of the world, but nowadays they are so polarized. Do we have to get ready to pay a lot for this information? Is there a middle ground?
I mean, but the irony is that, now, incidentally, let me start by saying that somebody who's been a journalist as long as I have, I think people should pay for journalism. I'm very strongly of that point of view. But I mean, it is, in the old days, if you wanted to get a newspaper, you had to pay for it.
But it's just one or two, I think
Yeah,
it's free.
but I think now the situation is, and I personally make the point of subscribing to various, even quite small sums of money. Different, if I think they're doing a good job, even though you can get that information free, I feel obliged to pay for it because, you know, nobody can live on air. So the temptation is you can get a lot of quite good quality information without paying a cent, but I don't think you should.
Well, with that, then we thank Steve for a very, very illuminating talk. And I hope that in the not too distant future, we can invite you again on other occasions to talk to the Hong Kong or wider community in this country. As Steve said, we have to live on something. Therefore, we do have a donation box over there. You know, the talk series, they are organized by a group of mainly academics who settle in this country. It is purely voluntary work and all that. So every time we need to have some administrative expenses and all that. Therefore, donations are welcome now. But if no donation is still okay, but we have to live on something anyway. All right, thanks a lot, and hope that we will see you next time. End of October, there will be another talk by academics from Macau, previously at Macau University, talking about the one country, two systems being practiced in Macau and how to compare it with Hong Kong's experience. The last Sunday of October will be our next talk series. Anyway, thank you once again.